Hi, everybody. Kenton J. Moore here. Contest time. My short story collection, The Dark Below the Ice and Other Stories, will be coming this Halloween 2023. It's a collection of my horror, thriller, suspense stories, all the dark stories that I've been writing over the years when the mood saw fit. I'm going to be reading you one of those stories from that book. This is called The Touch of Shadow. At the end of this video, once the story is complete, I'm going to ask you a very difficult question about that story. And if you think you know the answer, send me a private message on my Facebook group. And the first 10 people to correctly guess the answer to the question will get a free copy of the book and some custom bookmarks. All right, enjoy the story. This is called The Touch of Shadow. The bitter chill of approaching winter bit Jacob Turner's cheek as he held his .303 rifle tight to his shoulder. The dusk of coming night blanketed him like a soft quilt woven by a caring grandmother. His breath rose in wispy streams to dissipate in the waning sunlight. With all the calm and poise he could muster, Jacob waited patiently in the grass, listening with every ounce of his concentration for the sound that he had heard. Above him, a gentle breeze rustled the dying leaves of a birch tree. Jacob cautiously raised his head so he could see above his scope. His rifle rested on a dead pine that he lay behind. About 50 paces beyond his hiding spot, the trees thinned a little, allowing a great view of a marshy clearing that was stretched out to a distant tree line. The fading light was hindering Jacob's already limited ability to see what had made the noise he heard, but that did not stop him from scanning the horizon as diligently as an artist appraises his work. In the dusk, he could still pick out movement, but it was confined to the swaying silhouettes of the tall trees all around him. He scrutinized the marsh and the forest floor before him, but the world was a silent black canvas and did not relinquish its secrets. Finally resigning to having missed what made the sound, Jacob let out a long breath and looked over at his faithful companion, Jake. The big Siberian husky simply looked at him with an ear-up, head-askew glance that said he was curious about his owner's obvious tension. Jacob knew that if the dog sensed nothing, then more than likely there was nothing there. He reached out with his trigger hand and scratched the dog behind its ears. Jake lapped his warm tongue against Jacob's exposed wrist as he graciously accepted the affection. "You're right, aren't you, boy? I might just be losing my touch in the old age. There's no deer out there, just my imagination, right?" Jacob shifted his gaze back to the marsh as he continued to scratch behind the dog's ear. The forest remained still and silent. The dog yawned, bringing Jacob's attention back to it. Jake was large for a husky, even a male. Sometimes Jacob had wondered if the previous owners had lied about the purity of his breed. Even if they had, it would have been impossible to tell. His markings were beautiful, a distinct mixture of white and black hues in a thick coat that covered powerful muscles. His white eyes shone with brilliance, even in the fading light. There was no more faithful companion to be had out here in the wild. The dog was Jacob's best friend. For as long as he could remember, Jacob had been hunting these woods. As a child, he often came out with his father and his grandfather. They would spend weeks in the summertime charting the migration of deer and finding the most active game trails for the moment the season would be open. When his grandfather passed away, the act of hunting and simply being in the woods brought Jacob and his father closer together. It was their ritual to hunt. They'd never missed a season until the year his father died. That year, and every year since, Jacob had not been to the woods once. Something about them had become hollow to him, almost as though the soul of the woods had aged into the afterlife along with his father. As time rolled on, however, Jacob began to feel a need to return to the woods again, a beckoning to go where he had once found profound peace. When the season had opened, he packed his rifles, gear, and supplies into his pickup and headed for the woods once more. This was his first time being out alone, though, alone except for his dog and his thoughts. Jacob laid the rifle down on the ground and rolled over, resting the back of his head against the log as he looked up at the forest canopy above him. In the breeze, the leaves rustled softly, and some fell slowly to the ground as the shifting season took its toll on the forest. All around him, Jacob could smell the sweet decay of the leaves as the season inexorably marched towards winter. Jacob's gaze slid from the birch above his head to a dying pine a few feet away. He stared up at the browning needles hanging from the towering tree limb, and he found himself hoping for a long, cold Canadian winter. Sure could use a long winter this year, Jake. If something doesn't kill these bugs soon, there won't be much forest left to hunt in. Snap. Jacob flipped awkwardly onto his stomach and fumbled to get his rifle into a firing position. He pushed his hat back from his bushy green eyebrows and took up aim. The coating on his scope made the forest a little easier to see as he scanned the trees and the marsh for the source of the sound. This time he was sure he had heard it. Something was out there, and judging from the game trail and tracks he'd spotted earlier, it had to be a deer. Once more, the forest showed no signs of life. Nothing moved save the gentle sway of the treetop. It never occurred to him, but there was no sound at all save the whisper of the breeze in the trees. Jacob frowned and blinked a few times. He looked over at Jake. The dog was alert this time, but focused on Jacob, not the marsh. "Didn't you hear it, boy?" Jake licked Jacob's face and whimpered. Jacob pushed the dog away and wiped the slobber from his bristly beard. "I am losing it, boy. Come on, let's head for the truck. I'm getting the heebie-jeebies out here." Jacob went about gathering his gear with no haste at all. It was close to full dark now, and they had a good walk back to the truck. Chastising himself for letting it get so dark, he gathered his lunch kit and placed it in his pack. Next, he pulled up the ground sheet he'd been lying on, folded it, and placed it into his pack as well. He slung the pack over his shoulders and then picked up his rifle and flashlight. He put the light in his pocket, deciding instead to keep what little night vision had been intact for the time being. "Come on, boy, we'll try again tomorrow. Maybe we'll have better luck over by the creek." Jake trotted ahead into the trees as Jacob began the long hike back to the truck. Jacob watched him stop here and there to sniff at things Jacob could only begin to imagine. He held back from the dog to see if he could still see him from far off. Even in the fading light, the dog's movement was distinguishable against the still background of the forest. He had to assure himself, though, and so he continued to hold back farther to gauge how long he could track his companion. Jake did not seem to mind and slipped further away without looking back. Snap. Jacob spun to face the way he had come. Without even realizing it, he'd brought the rifle up on aim from his hip. It had sounded as though a twig had broken underfoot. The sound had come from behind him. He scrutinized the darkness, trying with all his might to catch a glimpse of something moving in the shadows. Nothing did. An icy chill shuddered through Jacob. For the first time in his entire life, he felt exposed in the woods. He'd always felt comfortable here in the past. Now he felt as though a stranger had invaded his home. He shivered, even though he felt warm. Slowly, he forced himself to relax. The rifle lowered in his hand, and he let out a sigh. A gust of cold air made the hair at the nape of his neck stand up. The breeze had changed to a wind. "Get it together, man," Jacob said under his breath. "It's probably just a pine cone from a dead tree." Snap. It was not a pine cone. This time the rifle did not stop at his hip. He found himself rapidly scanning the forest around him through the piercing view of his scope. The coatings on the lens added an eerie luminescence to the forest. He whipped the barrel of his rifle to and fro, searching the darkness for some sign of threat. He felt an ominous cloud of fear fall over him like the dark billowing of a raging storm cloud. His heart hammered in his chest. His attention was fixed on the trees and the shadows they played along the path toward where he had been. Snap. Panic welled up in his throat. A million questions began running through his mind. Something was out there. He was now sure of it. Whatever it was seemed to be stalking him. He could not see it. It was invisible in the shadows of the forest, but he was sure beyond doubt that it was there. "Who's there?" he shouted weakly against the dark. His wrinkled hands were shaking. He had to blink to try and focus his vision through the scope. Blind terror consumed him. He had never felt this way before. He had heard these same sounds a million times before, but it had always been a deer. This felt like something altogether different. Against whatever it was that was out there, he felt like the prey. His grip on the rifle tightened. He was prey with teeth. Snap. Jacob fell to a knee, futilely attempting to steady his aim. To either side of the trail, shadows seemed to come alive. He blinked to clear his vision and shook his head. He tried to tell himself that his mind was playing tricks, but it did nothing to calm him down. He blinked again, quickly wiping his hand across his brow. There was no sweat. His hand went to his pocket and fumbled for his flashlight. He tried hard to control his shaking. Snap. It was behind him now. Without thinking, he spun and squeezed the trigger. The dark calm of the forest erupted with the violent concussion of the shot as the rifle fired. In that instant, all that was calm suddenly plunged into chaos. The echoes only made the crack seem louder. And then it was still again. Silence rushed in to fill the void left by the gunshot. The only sound Jacob could hear was the ringing in his ears. He struggled to gain composure. Nothing made sense. Adrenaline coursed through his veins like liquid fire, making it extremely difficult to recall recent events. Something was amiss, and he had to focus through the fog to remember what it was. There had been the snapping sound. It seemed to follow him. Closer and closer it had been. Suddenly it had been behind him. It filled him with terror that whatever it was had found its way behind him without knowing. He'd spun and fired before thinking about it. There'd been another sound, though, mixed in with the sound of the shot. It had been familiar but somehow strange, somehow out of place. Jacob gingerly felt the ground beneath him for the flashlight that had fallen from his pocket. A new fear gripped him as his fingers found the cold metal shaft of the light. Trembling, he flicked the switch. His heart stopped. The sound had been a yelp. Jake lay on the trail a few feet from him, sprawled out on the ground. Blood matted the left side of his face. He was not moving. Jake, Jacob managed to gasp as his rifle fell to the ground. He scrambled towards his dog. Jake, he said again, picking the animal's limp form up in his hands. No! In shock, Jacob did not notice a sudden numbness in the fingers of his left hand. Snap. Jacob whirled around. This time he had no rifle to aim into the darkness. It lay on the trail near where the sound had come from. He pointed his flashlight into the woods with his right hand as his left held the dead body of his companion. The numbness was spreading to his whole hand. A young boy stood on the trail, not 2 paces the other side of Jacob's rifle. The sudden appearance of something so unexpected froze Jacob to the bone. His shuddering stopped. Pure, absolute fear gripped him. The boy just stood there on the trail, not moving, not smiling, and not speaking. His clothes were dark, almost all black save a few scattered designs. He wore black cargo pants low on his waist, the band of his underwear rimming his waist above the pant line. A sweater unzipped in the front and the hood pulled up hung limply from his shoulders. His face was shrouded in shadow. Jacob could do nothing more than stare with his eyes wide and his mouth hanging open. He could barely take a breath. The boy took a step forward. His mouth opened, and the voice that ushered forth made the hair on Jacob's neck stand on end. "You shot your dog," the boy said, his voice like a moaning whisper and a piercing howl, all rolled into one. Jacob said nothing. He dropped Jake's body back to the ground and shook his hand. His whole left side had gone numb. His right hand started to shake again. The boy took another step forward, the beam from the flashlight piercing the shrouded veil of darkness that lay across the boy's face. Where his eyes should be, gaping holes into nothing stared back, a shadow that the light could not touch. Jacob clutched his hand to his chest, dropping the flashlight to the ground. He stared open-mouthed at the ground where the body of his closest friend lay. He could not pull his breath against the racking pain in his chest. The boy stepped closer, a ghost made of shadow. "What are you?" Jacob managed with the last of his breath. As the boy stepped beside Jacob, he reached his hand out and touched Jacob's shoulder. The boy spoke into the silence, his voice like howling wind over thunder, as the world fell to blackness darker than the night. "I think you know." In the woods on a trail meant for animals, a deer comes across the crumpled bodies of a man and his dog. Cautiously it approaches, unsure of any danger. Nearby, a pine cone falls from a dead tree, shaken loose by the wind. As it hits the ground, the deer darts off into the woods. Snap. So, the question, who's the boy? If you think you know the answer to the question, send me a private message. Don't put it public because you don't want anybody else to get the answer too. Send me a private message on my Facebook group. Guess who the boy is. If you're correct, you'll win a copy of The Dark Below the Ice coming on Halloween. Collection of 12 of my short stories, all very similar to this. Some of them longer, some of them shorter, but gives you an idea what to expect. Thanks for listening. Hope you enjoyed it. Before I post this video, I will be putting a trigger warning on, obviously, because if you've made it this far, you'll know why. But yeah. Who is the boy? Good luck.